right, well, happy Earth Day, everybody. So I have to admit, when I was first invited to speak here, I was a little bit more nervous than I normally am to speak. Optimism about our Earth is in short supply right now, and I wasn't completely convinced that I would be able to muster enough. As I was preparing, headlines were going across my newsfeed. The Great Barrier Reef reaches its terminal stage. Coral reefs are in more trouble than we thought. When I tell people that I am a marine biologist who works to save coral reefs and other special ocean places around the world, I typically get one of two responses. Cool. Or, but isn't it a lost cause? And I have to admit, sometimes I struggle with the same doubt. And yet, each day, I get up and I go to work. Why? Because somehow I still have hope. In the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, hope is the belief that if we work hard enough, we can make things better. And it needs a great deal of courage to have hope. And so today, I wanted to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story about courage, one that gives me hope. The story takes place in one of our last wild treasures, the Bird's Head Seascape in West Papua, Indonesia. As a marine ecologist and someone who has had the pleasure of working there for the last 9 years and living there for 4, I can tell you without a doubt that there is no other place like it on Earth. With more fish and coral species there, the Bird's Head Seascape is the very epicenter of marine biodiversity on the planet. Being underwater there is nothing short of electrifying. I could happily entertain you until cocktail hour with beautiful photos from the seascape or tales of happy encounters with its majestic inhabitants, but I won't. Instead, I want to tell you the story of thousands of people, most of which are indigenous Papuans, who have worked together with Conservation International and a coalition of over 30 conservation partners for the last 12 years to transform this place from a playground for poachers to one of the healthiest and most productive marine environments on the planet. I'm going to tell you their story through the story of one, my teammate and my friend, Chris Tebu. Papua is Chris's home. He's an indigenous leader from the Maya tribe, the first inhabitants of an area called Raja Ampat. For centuries, Chris's ancestors lived off of the abundance that Papua provided. And generation after generation, they passed down traditional knowledge and a traditional system of natural resource management called SASI that ensured that each generation was left with enough. Despite this rich traditional knowledge, they were wholly unprepared in the 1990s when there was an influx of poachers from other areas of Indonesia and Asia who, having already destroyed their own reefs, were attracted to Papua's seemingly endless resources. These poachers brought with them fish bombs, long lines, and cyanide. They completely ignored traditional ownership of these reefs, and they hammered them. Many of Chris's generation, deeply frustrated with what they were seeing and lack of options, ultimately picked up the same practices. Very quickly, the limits of Papua's resources were found. As fish populations plummeted, indigenous Papuans, 75% of which rely on fish as their primary source of protein, were left hungry. Over half are considered to be food insecure, with 13% experiencing involuntary reoccurring hunger. Most of these were women and children. It was from this context that the Bird's Head Seascape initiative was born. In 2004, Conservation International formed a coalition of partners, including the Nature Conservancy and WWF, dedicated to working together with local Papuan communities and local governments to protect this reservoir of marine biodiversity. The goal was to protect marine biodiversity while simultaneously enhancing food security, local livelihoods, and protecting Papuans' traditional ways of life. But in a land with no conservation capacity and barely formed governments, how does one begin? Many conservation programs would have brought in experts from other parts of Indonesia to fill the capacity gap. We hired Chris. Chris was a respected leader from his community, but like most in his community, didn't have access to education past 8th grade. He had never studied biology, and he had never used a computer. And yet somehow Chris knew intuitively that his future and the future of his children was inextricably linked to the health of Papua. And so we invested in Chris with training and mentorship for years for Chris and a whole cohort of Papuan leaders like him, with the goal that they, not us, could ultimately lead the Seascape into the future. Chris struggled. He struggled to learn Excel, basic grammar, report writing, things that I would imagine some of us in this room still struggle with ourselves. But he brought a different kind of brilliance. Chris could absorb conservation theory and science and creatively apply it in ways that would inspire his community. As fish biologists, we know that larger female fish can produce exponentially more eggs than their petite counterparts. So for example, a 3-foot fish can produce 20 times more eggs than 1/2 her size. Chris took that science and wove it into a Papuan-style story about big mamas that ended up becoming part of the local fishing lore and helped convince local fishermen that they should set aside large areas of the ocean for their fish to grow big. When we were struggling with reconciling conservation goals and traditional ownership, Chris helped map out traditional ownership rights and tenure across every village and taught us about the tradition of Sasi so that we could incorporate it in. That way, the Marine Protected Area network that we were creating could reinforce, not contradict, traditional ownership rights. And in this way, we help to motivate local Papuan communities through a bottom-up process to declare the largest marine protected area network and no-take zones in all of Southeast Asia. And when those zones and protected areas were threatened by poachers, Chris devised a rotating patrol system in which local tenure holders and community members would participate on a rolling basis in the enforcement and management of their protected areas. In this way, every single community member had an active role in protecting their ecosystems. And while they were on duty, Chris and his deputies would deliver conservation trainings to all of them. I helped train Chris, but Chris trained thousands. Chris's community patrols bravely went after poachers, sometimes in boats much larger and even with bombs. And yet, they were successful, reducing poaching by outsiders by over 90%. And thanks to those big mamas, the fish are coming back. In some of the protected areas, we're seeing biomass rebounding almost over double, and in some of the no-take zones, quadrupling of fish biomass. Local fishers are catching 2.5 times the amount of fish with the same level of effort. And just last month, I dove on a reef surrounded by a dozen reef sharks, a place that 10 years ago, it would have been hard to see one. These ecological results, stable and positive trends for fish and coral, offer a bit of a ray of hope, even with rising temperatures, in contrast to global trends of decline. And what about for the people? Tourism is growing rapidly, with 20 to 30% increases in annual arrivals every year, and is now the foundation of the local economy. Locally owned, Papuan-owned homestays alone brought in $1 million into local families last year. And perhaps most importantly, we now have documented that the marine protected areas are driving significant increases in food security and in educational enrollment across the seascape. Chris is now the lead technical advisor for the entire Bird's Head Seascape Marine Protected Area Network. And for perspective, the seascape is roughly the size of Great Britain. So this is a pretty large area that he's now managing. The teams that he helped to create have been embedded in a new co-management structure with the local government, allowing them to have stable employment and government funding. Through the work of the Bird's Head Seascape Coalition and Chris and people like him, the communities of West Papua are on the brink of securing a sustainable future. But we are not done yet. Now we are working to ensure that our impact is enduring. To that end, we've launched the Blue Abadi initiative, an initiative to ensure the financial sustainability of the seascape long-term. As with the seascape itself, reaching sustainability has required both local and global contributions. Over 70% of the revenue needed to protect this place has been secured through Indonesian revenue sources. The government has quadrupled its contribution to marine protected areas as it saw tangible results for its constituents. And tourism user fees now bring in over $1 million directly for conservation each year. Our global community has also chipped in. 2 months ago, we launched the Blue Abadi Fund with initial commitments of $23 million, making it on track to be the world's largest dedicated marine conservation trust fund ever. The name we chose, Abadi, means forever in Bahasa Indonesia. And it is through Blue Abadi that we will ensure that Chris and the teams that he helped create have the financial resources that they need to protect the Bird's Head Seascape, the single greatest reservoir of marine species on the planet, and to protect it forever, for their benefit and for ours. So while my story is done, our work is not. New challenges emerge daily, whether in the form of new political climates, rising temperatures, or tourism now growing so fast that it threatens to love the place to death. The Bird's Head, and in fact the entire Earth that we celebrate today, needs all of us. From local indigenous communities to governments to scientists to conservationists to explorers to inventors to investors. We must all take action, and we must form those coalitions that can work together to bring real change. If we do, then I think there's still hope. Thank you, and terima kasih.
Thank you, Laure. We have time for one question. Anyone? Succinct? Go ahead.
So I think this is an incredible success story of how you can bring global knowledge, and when you adapt it locally, it really seems to be working. So I was wondering if you have, what's your approach on how to merge these localized initiatives with international treaties that could be enforced more, larger scale? What's the best way to approach that? Because I feel like a lot of international cooperation is failing because there isn't enough local knowledge, because there aren't enough resources, I guess not enough agencies like yours that would go to those places and actually work with local people. So what do you think is the best way to scale up to make this happen in more places?
That is a phenomenal and difficult question. Thank you for that. So For me, I think, the way you started to frame it was bringing kind of global knowledge local, and certainly there was an aspect of that. But I think the more powerful piece of it is capturing local knowledge, understanding it, creatively combining it with global knowledge and figuring out a way to make it work on the ground. That's going to be different in every place, but the acknowledgement of and respect for that knowledge, that it is science, it is tradition, it is as powerful as a lot of the work that we do kind of on the global stage, and making sure that that type of knowledge is embedded in and respected in our international treaties, in our international conversations, that it's not just, and I'm a scientist and I love science, but it's not just scientists speaking to scientists or policymakers speaking to policymakers, but we have indigenous wisdom and local wisdom part of that conversation, because I think that's where you're going to get the most powerful solutions coming out.